Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's session of Lighthouse Leadership Live. My name is Nico Homan, and I'll be your host for today's session. Today, we're going to be talking about the Florida Realtors As-Is contract. And what we'll be doing is we'll be taking a look at that contract from the point of view of the buyer's agent. And that is, we are representing the buyer in a transaction, and we would like to put in an offer on a home. For our example today, we're going to be using this particular property here on the local MLS. And so what we do is now we've decided, okay, this is the contract, or this is the house that we want to write a contract on. Now we need to set up a contract. What's really convenient about the MLS is they offer a software called Transaction Desk, and they have a one-click link to set up a potential contract with this home. So if you go up here to the top where you have the icon that says TD, you'll notice, so hover over it, it says Transaction Desk. Go ahead and click on that, and Transaction Desk is going to open up in a new tab for you. It's going to open up a transaction in your Transaction Desk. And right now we are all good with these settings that we have right here. We want to be added as the selling agent. We create it. Now what this is going to do in Transaction Desk is going to create a folder for us with all of the required documents and things that we need for this particular contract. And so what we can do is we can keep clicking next and head over to the next sections of the contracts until we have all of our forms and documents ready to go. So right here we have our transaction dashboard. And every time we log into our Transaction Desk, we can open this up and we can check the status of this contract. We can see all the different forms and documentations that we need. Now, the two biggest ones that we're gonna use and that I keep mentioning are your forms up here in this box and your documents here in this box. Forms are pre-populated contract documents that Transaction Desk has that are tied in with the Florida Realtor Association. That Transaction Desk specifically knows where the signature and date lines, the initial lines are. It automatically sets that up for you whenever you want to use the e-signing program. Documents, on the other hand, are contract documents that are not already pre-populated in the Transaction Desk software, and you are going to have to manually enter where those signature and initial lines are going. But for now, we are going to start with our forms, and we're going to start specifically with the as-is contract. So you go over here, you click on Add Forms, and we want to scroll down the far bar residential contract and addendum. And we want to use this one, the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. So we're going to add this into our forms and click on it, and it's going to open up. Now, the vast majority of contracts today written are with the as-is contract, and that's simply because it's a seller's market. As such, the as-is contract here, what it does, it will allow the seller to essentially sell the home in the condition as it is. It also then allows for the buyer to do inspections on the home and then back out for whatever reason they'd like. And that really is the biggest difference between the as-is contract and the contract for residential sale and purchase, or what you also here call the CRISP contract. In that contract, they specifically include language for the seller and buyer to agree to make repairs. In the as-is contract, you explicitly say that you are going to accept the home in the condition as it is. So we open up the form and we have our document here. And a lot of it is pre-populated. So since we tied it into the MLS, it automatically pulled for us the property address, the legal description, the seller name, and some other important bits of information throughout the contract. But we, as a buyer's agent, have to fill out some documents and some forms here in this contract before we submit it. So first things first, we need to make sure that we have the correct buyer. So we have Mr. Homebuyer 1 and Mrs. Homebuyer 1. And what we want to make sure is we have the exact correct spelling and legal description of the individual's name. This is what's going to be used on all of the title work, the mortgage work, and the other paperwork that we're going to be having for this contract. The buyer's and seller's name needs to be exactly correct because it's going to be used on all documents. So something simple as that. Make sure that it's correct. Property description, again, it's pulled automatically, but you just want to double check and make sure all that is good. Paragraph 1D, personal property. Things that are included in the home include appliances, blinds, things like that. Things that are not explicitly included in the contract are the washer and dryer, pool pump and related equipment, and some other items. So if you want the seller to leave the washer and dryer in the house, you will need to include that in this line here, line 20, washer and dryer. You want to make sure that you have that. If you as a buyer's agent talk to your buyer and they say they're going to bring their own washer and dryer and they don't want to worry about it, well, then you can just leave that blank, or you can put NA. Line 1E, the following items are excluded from the purchase. So that would be if the seller alerts you that they are specifically taking an item from paragraph 1D, then they want you to know that that is going to be taken with them. So let's say someone is taking their kitchen refrigerator with them. So we say kitchen fridge, then that item is going to stay, or the seller is going to keep that item with them when they move. Now, paragraph 2 here, purchase price and financing information. So for this purposes of this demonstration, we're just talking about the flow of the contract, what the language of the contract says. We're not going to be worried too much specifically on pricing, negotiation, things like that, because we've already covered that, and we will cover that in upcoming Lighthouse Leadership Live sessions. But for now, let's just assume that we're going to be putting an offer at our list price. So we have our list price right here. And now simply, if we were just to offer cash and we have our list price, you can see here that it automatically added in line 2E what the balance to close was for the buyer. Now this only includes the principal amount for the purchase price of the home. As you can see, it does not include buyer closing costs, prepaids, and prorations. So that is additional. Those are additional closing costs and closing fees on top of the actual principal amount. But for this example, we're going to assume that we're going to be using a fixed rate 30-year mortgage, which is typically what most home buyers are going to be using. To consider this contract legally binding, we also need to put a consideration down. And consideration is a monetary amount, essentially greater than $1, that allows us, the buyers, to have a formally binding written contract. Now, in real estate, that's called the escrow deposit. And with that, typical amounts can vary. Anywhere from $500 to $10,000 is typically an acceptable amount. But for our purposes here, we'll use a simple amount. And we want to check that it's to be made within typically 3 days of the effective date of the contract. That means within 3 days of both buyers and sellers receiving signed copies of the contract, the buyer or the buyer's agent must deposit the escrow deposit with the selected title company. Now, oftentimes the listing agents will give us who the title company should be. And as you can see here, they have given us that information. So we want to make sure that we copy paste that information from the MLS into our transaction desk software. So we have the name of the title company, we have their address, we have their phone number, and we have their email address. So we can enter all of that information here inside of the contract documents. Next, we have additional deposits. So in this instance, we are only going to be depositing an escrow payment once, and that's at the time that we have our contract signed, within 3 days of the effective date. There are other ways that you can make additional deposits. So let's say that you were only going to deposit half of the escrow deposit amount, and then you wanted to deposit the other half at a later date. You could do something like that. There are plenty of ways to negotiate the escrow deposit amount, and it doesn't always have to be the same. It can be different. So I would encourage you to use a little bit of creativity and figure out what's an acceptable way for both the buyers and sellers to agree on the escrow amounts. But for now, we'll leave it as a standard amount. Financing. So paragraph 2C, the financing amount expressed as a dollar amount or a percentage. So this line is very, very important. This is essentially saying how much money the buyer is going to use as a mortgage. So if we wanted to say the buyer is going to be having a 20% down payment loan, and 20% down payment loan, a conventional loan, we would enter 80% here as our financing percentage. If they were going to be using FHA and only putting 3.5% down, then our financing amount would be 96.5%. And with that, as you can see, as we enter our percentages in, our balance to close will change. So it automatically adds up exactly what your financing amount is, what your down payments are, to get a total balance to close. So for this instance, we're going to assume that we're using a 80% loan to value ratio. With this one, we do not have any other down payments or deposits. And so we are going to have everything blank at 0. And so we know, okay, if we have this amount as our purchase price, we have this amount as our escrow, and now we have this amount as our financed amount. That means here in line 2E, we know this is what the buyers will need to bring to closing table as far as their down payment. We'll get to the closing costs a little bit later. Paragraph 3, that has to do with when the seller has to respond to the buyer after the buyer submits an offer. Typically 2 days is pretty standard. But again, with negotiations, that can be changed. It can be as early as 6 hours from the time you submit your contract to as late as a week. And it really just depends on the situation of the particular offer. And then we'll cover a little bit more on negotiation strategies in the later date. But for now, we'll say 2 days away from now, and we'll set it up just like that. Closing date. The closing date is, again, another negotiation point, but it can be pretty standardized in that it depends on the type of property and the type of financing that you're going to be using. So with a cash transaction, you can close in as little as 2 weeks. With a conventional finance loan, you can close in about 30 days. If it's a VA, FHA, USDA, or other special type of financing, you'll average about 45 days to close. But again, that also depends on when the buyer is available to move in, when the seller is ready to move out, and a couple other factors. So again, the closing date can be negotiated, but in this instance, we're going to plan on 30 days into the future. Next up here, extension of closing date. So if need be, the buyers or the financing company needs to satisfy the CFPB requirements, we can exceed the closing date within 10 days without having to have a new addendum. Paragraph 6, this property is not subject to lease, so we do not have to worry about that. If you were buying a home that has a tenant currently in it, and you as the new homeowner wanted to keep the existing tenants in the house, you would need to make sure to check 6B. But since we don't have to worry about that, this particular home is vacant, we're good to go here. Paragraph 7, assignability. Always want to make sure as a buyer, we want to check may not assign this contract. Assignability essentially means that we are under contract as buyers with the seller. But what we are doing is we are assigning the responsibility and duties of the contract to a third party. And with that, we as the signees, the buyers of this contract, we are no longer legally responsible. Although our names are on the contract, it is not us that will be closing. In that instance, that's used mostly for investors, for wholesalers, but for our purposes as regular real estate agents representing buyers, we want to check may not assign this contract. The financing paragraph. So this one is important. If we're simply using cash, we can check box A, but since this one we know we're using financing, we're going to be checking box B, that this contract is contingent on the buyer obtaining financing. Specifically, a conventional loan that we will have within 30 days after the effective date at a fixed rate and a 30-year term. Now this particular box here, the percentage of the interest rate, typically we leave that one blank. That way, that allows the buyer's financing to not be contingent upon a particular number. However, if a buyer's financing is very much contingent on not exceeding a particular interest rate, a 3.5% or 5% interest rate, whatever that number may be, we want to include that. But in most instances, you want to leave that number blank. Paragraph 8B, we want to make sure that we're checking this box that within 5 days after the effective date, the buyer will make in good faith efforts the application for a loan. And that's essentially saying that, yeah, we're buyers, we're ready to move forward on financing now that we're under contract. Now, hopefully your buyers have already been pre-approved before they even go through the offer process. And that's something that we'll talk about in a different episode. And with that, the remainder of this financing paragraph here essentially gives permission and authorization and duties and responsibilities to both the buyer's agent and the seller's agent, saying that the seller's agent is allowed to contact the mortgage company directly and get updates about the buyer's financing. Even if the buyer or buyer's agent is unavailable for comment or not providing any information, the seller or its seller's agent is allowed to directly contact the mortgage agent to get the information. Paragraph 8C and 8D we won't be using since we're not using an assumption of an existing mortgage or the purchase money on a loan. Paragraph 9, closing costs. So as we talked about in paragraph 2 about the amount of down payment needed, not including closing costs, this is exactly where we talk specifically about the closing costs responsible for both the buyers and the sellers. In paragraph 9A, we have a list of what's required for the sellers to pay. And in 9B, we have a list of what's required by the buyers to pay. Now, typically for a buyer, you can expect your closing costs to range anywhere from about 2% to 4% of the final purchase price of the home. So if we take a look back at our purchase price of the home, we know that this is the amount. If we have about 2 to 4% of our contracted amount as our closing costs, we can expect that our closing costs as buyers can be anywhere around $4,000 to $8,000. Now, if the buyer would like to pay for that at the closing table, they're more than welcome to, but they can also ask the seller to pay for a portion or all of the buyer's closing costs. And that's here in line 9A where we would add that information. So if we, as a buyer's agent, and our buyers want to have the seller pay for a portion of their closing costs, we would write that here. So seller agrees to pay for up to $5,000 in buyer's closing costs and prepaids. And that's exactly how that information would be written. Or if you wanted to have a different dollar amount, or if you wanted to have a percentage of the final contracted price, we want to explicitly include that information here in paragraph 9A. Title evidence and insurance, we want to make sure that this amount is filled in, even if we left it blank. That is perfectly acceptable. Here, our local practice is that the seller shall designate and pay for the closing agent and the title company. Should the buyer decide to select the title company, you would select this paragraph here, 9C, number 2. However, if the buyer also picks, the buyer has to pay for the title policy. And in most instances, the buyer is less likely to have the cash than the seller would. So we oftentimes have the seller select the title company. Home warranty, line number 173. It is our practice that we ask the seller to provide a home warranty not to exceed a certain dollar amount. Now, again, this is another negotiation point. Some sellers will accept it, some will not. Sometimes we can pay for it out of our own commission. Sometimes we ask the other agent to pay for it out of their commission. It all depends on what is specifically negotiated between the buyers and sellers. But if we want a home warranty included in the contract, we must include it here in this particular paragraph. Special assessments. That is essentially when if a particular home or a particular homeowner is required to pay a fee or an assessment to a city, a county, an HOA, a governing board, essentially some external third party that has to do with the improvements of the home or the community. So for an example, if a condo association is repairing the roofs and they are charging each homeowner in the condo association a special assessment to pay for the cost of that roof, that would be an example of a special assessment. Now, let's say the condo association is in the middle of those renovations as we are selling a condo, and we as home buyers and as a buyer's agent are trying to buy that condo, we would likely want the seller to pay for all of that before we move in. And the seller is likely going to say, we'll pay for up until the move-in date. And that's what paragraph A and paragraph B represent. Do you want the seller to pay installments up until the time of closing? Or do you want the seller to pay the whole thing before closing? And we as buyer's agents in this instance want the seller to pay for everything before closing. If we're representing the listing, and we're a listing agent representing the seller, odds are we want to check paragraph 8A. In this instance, with buyer's agent, we're going to check paragraph 8B. If this home was in a flood zone, we would require an elevation certificate in order to purchase flood insurance, if that is something that is required. And if so, we would want to make sure that we have enough time to be able to complete a survey and an elevation certificate in order to get flood insurance. And finally, we have in paragraph number 12, the inspection period. And so this is one of the most important paragraphs in this contract. The Florida Bar Association has kindly bolded it and italicized it to make sure that you read it. But essentially what this is saying is that the buyer has a certain number of days after the effective date. So in this instance, we'll say 15 days after the effective date, and to do any and all inspections they would like to do to the home. During that time, if the buyer finds anything that's wrong with the home or anything that they don't like with the home, they can back out of the contract and receive their escrow deposit back. The seller is under no obligation to fix that, and the buyer is under no obligation to stay within the contract. However, you must notify the seller within the time period of the inspection period. If you cancel day 16 and your inspection period is only 15 days, you can no longer receive your escrow deposit back after canceling because of inspections. So if you want to make sure that you have a home inspector on call and ready to go, that way the moment you have a ratified contract, you can call and schedule your home inspector to make sure that everything is good to go with the home inspection. The buyer has the opportunity to do a walkthrough inspection or a final inspection either the day of or day before closing to make sure that the home is in materially the same condition as when they last saw it during the property inspection. And with that, that is essentially the end of the most important part of the contracts that we need to fill out. If you scroll down to the bottom, on the very last pages, between the inspection period and the bottom, you have a lot of standardization, you have definitions and certain items in the contract that if you wanted to know specifically more about or more about the process, that's what that includes. What we want to go down to is paragraph 19, addendum and additional terms. So most contracts will have an addendum or will have to add additional terms to it. For example, if this home was in a flood zone and we needed a flood insurance, we probably want to consider adding the flood insurance addendum. If this home was in a homeowners association, we must add that particular addendum. We always want to consider adding the appraisal contingency, which gives us as buyer's agents the opportunity to back out of the contract due to a low appraisal. If this home was also built before 1978, we want to check that we will include the lead-based paint disclosure. If we as buyers are currently homeowners and we need to sell our existing property first before we buy this particular home because we need to use the proceeds of the sale for our down payment, we want to make sure that we check this particular addendum. If we're submitting this offer as a backup contract, we want to make sure we check that addendum. And then if there are any issues regarding who is occupying the home before or after closing, say the buyer needs to move in before closing or the seller needs to stay in the home after closing, you want to make sure you have either the pre or post-closing occupancy addendum checkout. Then also one note here, if you are a licensee and buying your own home, you want to make sure that you have filled out this addendum, the licensee property interest, and what you have interest in the property as both the buyer and as a buyer's agent. With that, if you have any additional terms, we would enter them here, and we would fill out our buyer's name, our seller's name, our addresses for purchasing, and then we have our signatures. And that's it. So we have a 12-page document where the vast majority of items are pretty standard for us. Fortunately, this contract is written right down the middle. It doesn't represent the buyers too much. It doesn't represent the sellers too much. And so long as we have the important notes of what type of financing we're using, what the cost of the home is, if we're going to have any items stay or go with the property, when we would like the closing date, and if there are any closing costs to be paid additionally by the buyer and seller, we can pretty much have a ready-to-go contract. Now, as far as each addendum, we'll be talking about that in another lesson. As far as all the added addendums here, what they mean, when you use them, how do you use them, and things like that. But with that, we will end this particular lesson, and I encourage you to try and practice as many contracts as you can. Find sample properties, write potential contracts, and see which terms are available for you. So with that, thanks very much, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week. Bye-bye.